Welcome everybody. This is our second CRED talk of the season. My name's Haley Ross and I work with the Columbia Mountains Institute of Applied Ecology. We're CMI for short. And I join you today with the wildCAM network to present the second talk in our fifth season of CRED Talks. That's the Columbia Region Ecological Discussions. And today we're here to listen to Dr. Jason Fisher, who will share some insights in a talk titled Rocky Mountain Mammal Communities, Camera Trapping Brings the Effects of Development into Focus. In a moment, we're going to hear from Alice Granados, who will share a little bit of background on the wildCAM network. But before we do that, and while we still have some people signing in here, I'm going to take advantage of this moment and tell you just a little bit about CMI for those of you who are not familiar, because I know there are a lot of people online who haven't heard of us before. So CMI is a nonprofit society and association for people working in the various fields of ecology. Our home range is southern British Columbia, Canada, and increasingly we're seeing membership from across BC, Alberta, the Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. One of the main things we do is provide professional development opportunities for people working in the various fields of applied ecology. And that comes in the form of conferences and courses for the most part. So some examples from the last couple of years include an Intro to Wildlife Bioacoustics course, Advanced Field Ornithology courses, Wetland Classification courses, Plant ID courses, Critical Habitat Screening workshops, a variety of statistical methods courses, and a diversity of conferences that explore more complex topics like the ecology of regulated rivers or incidental take of migratory birds, or one we're working on now, of course, is the assessment of camera trap surveys for wildlife monitoring. The website, our website, cmiae.org, is the best place to find out about the stuff we do. And if you look in our resources tab, there are some proceedings documents from our major events, and I think those are a great resource that are often overlooked. For this particular project, the CRED Talks, our goal is to share knowledge and projects of interest to applied ecologists in the Columbia Mountains region and beyond. This is the first year we've moved the speaker series to a webinar format. So welcome to everybody who's here as a result of us going online. And of course, thank you to COVID for that. I think you'll have interest to know who's on the webinar today. So I'd like you to just take a moment to find the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. So if you aren't familiar with Zoom, and you move your mouse down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little bar with a bunch of icons pop up there. Hover your mouse over the chat, and then tell us your name and your affiliation and where you come from, including the country. From what I can see, we've got a great mix of people online here today, similar to our last CRED talk, with a mix of academics, environmental consultants, industry representatives, government resource managers, and folks from around the world. We've got representation today from Chile, UK, Mexico, the US, and the list goes on. At this time, I would like to thank the Columbia Basin Trust for their financial support of the series. With this support and generous donations provided by many of you here today, without this support, this project would not be possible. So great, I'm just seeing a bunch of people indicating where they're from, and that's really fun to scroll through. So thanks for participating on that. Next up, I wanted to thank everyone online today who generously donated to make this project possible. So a lot of you who were attending sent in a small donation. It might not seem like much, but collectively that makes a really big difference to us. So thank you very much. And now before I get into the nitty-gritty details, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the 4 nations on whose traditional territory I broadcast from today, and that's in Revelstoke, BC. And so that is the Sinixt, the Ktunaxa, the Secwepemc, and the Silks. All right, now the nitty-gritty details. So this webinar is being recorded and posted online, will be posted online later today. And I think for the best experience, it would be a good idea if you use the speaker view. All attendees have been muted for this session. So if the best way to communicate with us is to use that chat box that I described to you earlier. And we'll hold our questions until the end. So to pose a question, simply type it into the chat and we'll try to bring that up at the end. Okay, so now I'm going to, oh, you know what? I just realized I never shared my screen. I'm just going to do that now. All right, so next up, we're actually going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to introduce Alice Granados. So she'll give us a bit of background about the wildCAM network. Alice is the wildCAM science coordinator, and she's in her postdoc with the Wild Coexistence Lab with UBC.
Yeah, thanks, Haley. So like she said, I'm just going to give a really quick background about what wildCAM is. We're co-hosting this talk with the CMIA. Just in case people haven't heard of wildCAM, it stands for Wildlife Cameras for Adaptive Management. It's a network of camera trap users in Western Canada, mostly in BC and Alberta. It was started in 2018 and it's co-chaired by Cole Burton from the University of British Columbia and Andy Day from the BC Parks Foundation. Today we have over 100 members, and those people come from all different backgrounds, including universities. We have professors, we have grad students, First Nations biologists we have, as well as government biologists and citizen scientists. So we encourage anyone that's watching and that hasn't joined yet to check out our website. The link or the URL is on the slide, and I can post it in the chat box as well. So check it out and consider joining the network. And so the whole reason for having this network is to connect researchers across this region. So we wanted to make people aware of who is doing what in terms of camera trap research. And we hope that that will serve to facilitate collaboration as well as an exchange of knowledge. We also hope that by connecting people, we can synthesize data across projects and ask more large-scale questions about wildlife ecology and management issues that are relevant to this region. Having a network also lets us identify areas where more camera trap sampling is needed, so we can see areas where we don't have members from our network working and potentially prioritize those areas for future camera trap surveys. We're also focused on developing tools for best practices when it comes to methods in the field, as well as for analyzing camera trap data, as well as developing data tools that will help with processing camera trap data, as well as storing those data. And so today's speaker is Dr. Jason Fisher, and Dr. Fisher is one of the founding members of wildCAM, and he's one of the members of our advisory committee as well. He's a wildlife ecologist from the University of Victoria, and he focuses on how large-scale research can be applied to conservation issues. He's interested in how landscapes function to support biodiversity, and importantly, he uses his research to inform effective policies for the conservation of species. He's worked coast to coast across Canada in both terrestrial and marine environments. And he's published in over 40 different peer-reviewed journals. And his work has also been featured in international media articles, on TV, radio, popular books, as well as textbooks. And so we're really lucky and appreciative to have Jake's expertise as part of the wildCAM network. And so now we'll turn it over to him.
Thanks, Alice. So should I now share my screen?
That'd be great.
Got it?
Yep, got it.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much to CMI and to wildCAM for inviting me to give this talk today. I had originally conceived this talk for the conference that CMI was putting together on camera trapping and its usage for conservation. And since that couldn't go ahead, I thought, why not give it a shot as a webinar? So this is pretty synthetic talk. It cobbles together a bunch of different pieces of research that we've been doing in the Rocky Mountains over the last 15 or so years. The point of which is to talk about what the possibilities for camera trapping are. So we started using camera traps in the Rocky Mountains back in 2002, whenever the camera traps were relying on active infrared technology, where there was a transmitter and a receiver, and you had to line those two things up perfectly. And in order to trigger the camera, the animal had to break that beam, and the camera was film, so you could only get 36 photos. So you can imagine how well that works. We ended up with like one or two really great shots of animals, and that was about it. And then, of course, with the revolution that has been digital memory as well as digital cameras, their use has exploded, and we've in our research lab, the Applied Conservation Macroecology Lab, we've been exploiting that technology to, I think, its full advantage for the last decade and more. So I want to talk about some of the things we found, some of the things that are possible, and what's possible in the future, especially if a whole bunch of camera trappers get together to try to bring the effects of development into focus. My motivation, so until November, I was a research scientist for the Alberta government, and now I'm affiliated with the University of Victoria. My shtick over the last 2 decades has been to understand how mammal communities respond to change, to climate change and to landscape change. And then in my secondary role, I'm a pro rata scientific advisor to several government bodies, provincial and territorial governments. And so I work with governments to take that information, what I've found and what others have found, and then help ministers turn it into good conservation decisions. And so it's given me some insights into what makes that work well and what makes it not work well. I think our collective societal challenge here is turning research into effective conservation change. And that's increasingly difficult. There's lots been written about how Canada's Species at Risk Act is being implemented at a snail's pace. There's failure to protect species, not just in Canada, but globally. As if we haven't done enough. There's been a rolling back of protections recently in some governments. This is increasingly difficult. And part of that, I think, in my dealing with ministers and others, is that an error of omission beats an error of commission any day. It's a lot better, it's more politically strategic to just sit and wait than to make a dramatic action that then is a horrible mistake. You do not want the purpose of your life to serve as a warning to others. And that is a huge piece of inertia, and I think rightfully so. It's a very human, natural thing to do. So how do we convince governments that costly, both in terms of money and political capital, costly conservation decisions are worth implementing? There's a lot of factors behind this, but a lot been written about this in political ecology and psychology. From a scientific perspective, a great place to start, number one, is with data and really sound conclusions. And the more certainty you can provide to decision makers, then the more likely those research findings will be implemented into policy. So how can we do that? We faced the challenge over the last century, I think, that identifying problems and solutions requires really big data over big areas. And traditional research approaches have been pretty expensive, intrusive, species-specific, and pretty limited in time and space. I've used a lot of these, capture and collar, destructive sampling, live trapping, etc. You get pretty good high-resolution information on a few individuals of one species of a population. But in terms of informing the big questions, landscape change, climate change, their utility is not always necessarily there. Or if it is, it needs some augmentation from other sources. And that's where the opportunity comes in for remotely sensed data from camera trap networks. So cameras allow that mass production of biodiversity data. They're the eyes in the forest. They sit out there 24/7 for as long as you want them to, recording the presence and absence over time of individuals, which generates a huge amount of information. And then handled right, you can turn that information into data. And Chris Byrne on the last CRED talk did a great job of talking about how to handle camera trap data. And in a couple of papers that a whole bunch of us camera trappers wrote together, we talked about what's possible, and both in terms of what's possible now, but also what's possible in the future if we band together to create a planet-wide network of camera trap sensors from mammalian biodiversity. And I think this is what it's going to take for there to be real change and make real difference, I think, globally in terms of the decisions that are being made. So how do we do those things? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our experiences right here in the Canadian mountains, specifically in the Rocky Mountains and mostly on the east slopes, just because I worked for Alberta for a long time. And mountains are really where change has been observed the most. Even in very pristine environments like the WILLMORE Wilderness, which is just north of Jasper National Park, where there's nothing allowed in there pretty much except for hoof and foot, you're going to see lots of change over time through climate change. So here's an example of the kind of stuff that's happening with climate change. This is a Crow's Nest Pass in 1913, taken by the Bridgeland Survey. And this is the Mountain Legacy Project's retake of that photograph in 2012. And you can see the huge amount of forest infill creeping up those slopes. And in fact, an analysis between the historic and repeat photographs across the Rocky Mountain chain has allowed us to create distance maps that shows the degree of change over time and really pinpoint where that change is occurring. And you can see in that right-hand panel that a lot of that change has happened in the lowland areas and the wetlands, and then in the very top of the mountains in terms of those very high elevation alpine ecotones, which are becoming increasingly rare and threatened. So landscape change can affect climate change. Climate change can cause landscape change. But then there's also, of course, direct landscape change, which is what we are doing, the footprint that we leave on the environment. This map is from Global Forest Watch, which tracked the amount of industrial caused forest loss between 2000 and 2012. The redder it is, the deader it is. So you can see that in the oil sands, the amount of loss from that region has been 5.5% over that 12-year period. On the east slopes, in the protected areas, the loss was 6.8%, and unprotected areas, it was 7.9%, which radically eclipsed the Canadian forest mean of 3.1. So things are happening really fast in the mountains, especially on the east slopes, as we take advantage of the economically very, very important opportunities that exist there in terms of petrochemicals, forest harvesting, mining, and all the other things that drive our modern economy. And while those things are incredibly important, we all use them, I use them, they do come at a cost. And that is that anthropogenic development pervades the east slopes. We have long, thin strips of seismic lines, which are used for petrochemical exploration. We've got well pads for drilling, cut blocks, roads to service them all. And it creates this big patchwork that's research from UBC has shown is well outside of the historical analog for disturbance. So the kind of disturbance that's happening looks nothing like insect breaks, and looks nothing like forest fires. It's its own kind of thing. So the question remains is, how is all this development affecting Rocky Mountain mammal communities? Mostly what this development does is to knock down mature forest and allow early cereal vegetation to regrow in its place, or to maintain that site in a non-vegetated state. So in terms of aerial disturbances that actually have dimensionality to them, you've got well sites, and you've got cut blocks, but then you also got linear features such as road and seismic lines. And the effects that linear features and aerial features are expected to have is quite different because they do different things on the landscape. There's lots been written and researched about the effect of seismic lines, for instance, facilitating wolf travel. And I think there's good research to show that it facilitates travel for a bunch of other things as well. But what is the cumulative effect of all of this disturbance? Can we predict it in some way that allows us to target the best places to maybe restore or mitigate? Those are the big questions. And for that, we turn to camera trap data. So one of the beautiful things about camera trap data is that it's not species specific. You can get data on the entire mammal community all at the same place, all at the same time. So this is the big and fuzzy part of the talk, where I just show off a bunch of my favorite photos. But you can pick up grizzly bear very reliably. And so almost all these species, we have done analyses on the data. So we've turned that information into data and used it to answer some of these questions. So grizzlies and black bears are really common. You can get all of the cats, cougars and lynx and bobcat, the dogs, wolves, foxes, and I forgot coyotes. but coyotes we get a lot of, obviously. We get ungulates really regularly, including some of the rarer ones like woodland caribou, which are obviously a species of tremendous concern. Wapiti, moose, and white-tailed deer, which are also a big conservation concern from the other side, because like coyotes, their ranges are expanding dramatically into the mountains with, we think, some serious effects. You can get some of the rare ungulates in the high alpine, like bighorn and mountain goats, pardon me. And you get lots of smaller things too if you set your cameras up right, including red squirrels, flying squirrels, and ermines and things like that. The only thing we haven't got, I think, very reliably is stuff that's smaller than an ermine, smaller weasels and voles and whatnot. But all the other things, if you set your camera up right, you can get great information on these things. You can get rare ones too, such as wolverine. And I'm going to focus on wolverine because that's been my shtick over the last 15 years. But it also tells a really cool story about what we can learn about mountain mammal communities and how development affects those things. So we started wolverine research back in 2002 with those active film-based cameras. And then once we could, we switched over to digital memory and digital passive infrared. And at that time, there was very little known about wolverines in Alberta anyway. There's some really good work being done by BC MOE staff on wolverines in BC, but very little in Alberta. And so we wanted to address that. We had a sense, so there was a vague feeling that there was wolverine range retraction on the east slopes, that in places basically from the national parks, then moving east down into the lower foothills, which have traditionally been places where you get lots of wolverines. There's been trapping for them there for over a century. They're considered iconic wolverine habitat, but fewer and fewer sightings have been occurring of these things. And we wanted to confirm, first of all, is the range actually retracting there? And if so, what some of the causes might be. Getting at some of this information with old telemetry techniques is pretty difficult, because what telemetry tells you is basically an individual's behavior, where it chooses to be at any given point in time. And that can yield insight into what's important or not for that individual, but under a very specific range of circumstances. Really high resolution data of the kind that camera trap can't provide, but in this case, we needed some low resolution, but really spatially and temporally extensive data. And so we turned to camera traps. As I said, wolverines have lost about a third of their range. The historic is in dark gray and the current in light gray. You can see us on the east slopes of the Rocky Mountains right in here, where that range basically has pushed right up against the Rockies. I think a lot of people think of wolverines as a mountain and Arctic species, and that's only because that's where they've been pushed since European colonization. You can see they used to occur throughout the forested areas in the north, and right across the prairies too. So why have they been getting a bad rap? Well, they got a low birth rate, low juvenile survivorship. Population growth rates are therefore really low. They got large home ranges, which means they integrate a lot of disturbance. You put all this together and you've got species that exist naturally at low densities, and you throw added stressor on top of that, and then they take a dive. Here in Alberta, they're still designated data deficient, which is something that I would love to see changed in the near future, given we know a lot more about them than we did. Our approach, which is, and I say our, and it is our in the biggest sense of the word. This work was done and supported a lot by Alberta Environment and Parks, including folks on this phone call. So I really appreciate this big effort that we all put in together to understand this. So please keep that in mind, that all of this, I'm just the head talking here. This is the product of a lot of work from a lot of different people. Our approach is to measure wolverine occurrence using camera traps across gradients that run right from the border in the rock out east towards the foothills. In this case, we used a combination of camera traps and non-invasive genetic tagging, so we could get individual specific information from the DNA. But I'm going to focus a lot on what the cameras told us out of this. So each of these dots on the map represents one of our sampling stations. Our work was done first in the WILLMORE wilderness area and the adjacent foothills, and then in Banff National Park through collaboration with Tony Clevenger and Marion Barrueto and a whole bunch of others that were working there, and Alberta Environment and Parks to John Paczkowski and Ann Hubbs and others on the provincial land base. And so we surveyed wolverines across that whole area for a few years. The green dots are where we found wolverines and the black dots are where we didn't. And based on the math we did in this paper, we are pretty close to 99% sure that where we don't detect wolverines, wolverines are not occurring there. So you can see the black all on those east slopes and the green that situates right in the heart of the Rockies. And although some people might say, well, you know, that kind of makes sense. Wolverines, etc., are a mountain species. That wasn't the case. And a lot of those black dots in Kananaskis country in particular was a big surprise to a lot of people. We're missing wolverines where we think they should be. So why is that? And there's two schools of thought around wolverines. The first is that they're a snow specialist species, and work out of the United States has suggested that the best predictor of wolverine occurrence is persistent spring snow. That's assuming that they need snow dens in order to raise their young. And if you've got lighter snow and that melts earlier, like we have these days, then snow dens are going to be garbage and you can't raise up your young. The other alternative hypothesis we test is we thought, all right, well, in this environment, we get lots and lots of snow, but we're still seeing range retraction. So maybe something different is happening here. And maybe it has something to do with landscape change. So we modeled the occurrence of wolverine distribution against landscape and climate variables. So in these maps, the blue is the number of years of persistent spring snow. So the bluer, the dark blue stuff is where you get 12 years in which we analyzed the number of months of persistent spring snow leading into April. And as it gets later, you get less persistent spring snow. So you can see there is definitely a relationship there, which I think is important. The other variable we modeled is anthropogenic disturbance, which is in that sort of baby poop brown color, really illustrative map to show the extent of anthropogenic disturbance on the east slopes and how much of it there is. And this work was led by Nicole Heim, my first master's student, also worked for Parks Can at some point and Alberta Parks as well, who put on this monumental effort in Kananaskis and then helping out in Banff to pull this data together and do the analysis. And what Nikki found is that the cumulative effects of climate and landscape change best explain wolverine range contraction. So AIC weights is on the left is a measure of how well a particular factor explains wolverine occurrence, with 1 being awesome and 0 being not so great. So you can see that spring snow on its own got very little support. Linear features got some support. We looked at competitors that got some support. Land cover did okay, but by far it was the combination of these things that explained wolverine occurrence, which says that it isn't just a climate change question. It's not just a landscape change question. It's both of those things occurring simultaneously. So that takes the onus out of the lap of climate change mitigation and puts it squarely into the lap of land managers to enact some practices to help conserve wolverines on this landscape. So in fact, out of those, landscape change was the best predictor of wolverine distribution and density, not persistent spring snow. Although persistent spring snow did in fact play an additional effect. So the question is why? It's been posited that wolverines are just neophobic, meaning that they're really scared of things that are new, especially humans. I mean, we're pretty scary. We make a lot of noise on ATVs and whatnot. But then by the same token, there's a lot of folks who noted that wolverines do use linear features to travel quite a bit. You know, it's easier to walk on them. It's easier to walk on linear features for wolverines just as it's easier for wolves. So maybe the idea that these things are just scary to wolverines isn't the case, and there's something else at play. And this is where another master's student of mine, Jillian Chow-Fraser, who's now working for CPAWS, she took up the gauntlet and, using data from myself and from Nikki, explored the role of carnivore communities in wolverine declines. And this is really where camera trapping has provided an immense advantage. Because as I mentioned, the traditional modes of investigation have been quite species specific. You get a lot of high-res information about one species, but in terms of asking questions that span a community, that wasn't really possible before. But with camera traps capturing that entire community, you can ask these kind of community questions. And so Jill asked, what if it's not just the footprint? What if it's something else in this landscape? Maybe it's the things that wolverines have to contend with, because wolverines live a pretty high-risk lifestyle, right? So going around and scavenging things that other animals want to eat. So she looked at the effect of potential predation in terms of like cougars and bears and the things that might eat a wolverine. Competition in terms of the dogs that out there, the foxes and coyotes, the things that will come and eat the food that wolverines like to eat. Or maybe facilitation, with some evidence that maybe lynx go and kill things that wolverines then scavenge, and so lynx actually assist wolverines. And so, and she asked, maybe it's these things mediated by anthropogenic features, aerial features, and linear features. With a focus, we think, on coyotes. Now, coyotes are, like I said, invading the mountains, just as they've been expanding their range across North America. It's really cool work by Hody and Kays, has mapped out range expansion, the limits of range expansion for coyotes. And of course, that big red blob in the middle is not actually contiguous. There's big holes into it. And coyotes haven't traditionally been seen a lot in the high Rocky Mountains, but they've been moving in. So we asked, all right, if you've got coyotes as a novel thing moving into this landscape, and there's a lot of them, maybe they can hit those foraging opportunities before wolverines can. And so Jill tested the biotic drivers of habitat selection using camera traps and across two landscapes again, the Wilmore Wilderness and Kananaskis. So one of the other great advantages of camera traps is that you can take cameras from different landscapes, set there for different purposes, and then combine them, if the data are comparable, to ask some bigger across landscape questions. And that's what we did here. And Jill used a really cool temporally explicit approach where she basically asked, do you see wolverines and coyotes in the same place within the same week? Yes or no, and how often? And is that related to the level of disturbance in a landscape? And so through her analysis, she showed that wolverine weekly occurrence decreases with the proportion of linear features, which was a confirmation of what Nikki and others had found, and quite a dramatic drop, where when you have 0 proportion of linear features, you got 100% probability of wolverine occurrence, or pretty close to it. You increase that to just 3% of the landscape. 3% of the landscape will drop that probability down to something like 5%. That's a pretty big deal. But what's really interesting is the additive effect, or the interactive effect of coyotes. So in places where you get coyotes only, there's a positive response to coyotes to linear features. There's a negative response on the left side of wolverines to linear features. However, where you get wolverine and coyotes co-occurring in the same week, that's where there is a much greater percentage of linear features. In other words, where there are linear features, you are much more likely to see wolverines and coyotes co-occurring. So put a different way, wolverine are much more likely to co-occur with coyotes on disturbed landscapes. So in an undisturbed landscape on the right, wolverine occurrence can vary with wolverine occurrence, with coyote occurrence, pardon me. So there may or may not be a coyote there in that same place. In disturbed landscape, there's almost always a coyote present where there's a wolverine present, meaning that these two species have been pushed together in ways that they wouldn't have otherwise. So the lessons we pull out of this is that anthropogenic change is contributing to wolverine range contractions. Landscape change is helping to facilitate that, and coyotes are a likely mechanism. So looking beyond wolverines and coyotes, what are the effects of anthropogenic disturbance on the entire predator community? It would be really nice if we could pin one feature type as a primary culprit. If this is all a linear features problem with roads and seismic lines, then that really helps government to say, okay, we can prioritize this feature, we'll start restoring, we'll start mitigating, that'll solve, even if it solves like 3/4 of the problem, we're farther ahead. So can we actually pin this to a specific culprit? And through another analysis that Nikki did, she took all of the species that we detected in the Wilmore Wilderness in Kananaskis, wolverine, marten, bobcat lynx, wolf, fox, coyote, along with a bunch of landscape variables, and put them into a variance partitioning analysis, and looked for relationships between the landscape variables and the different species. What we were hoping to find is one arrow sticking up into multivariate space, that arrow being linear industrial footprint, which is, you can see it on the lower right-hand panel, lin-ind, and the other species all clustered around it. And that's not what we found. We found, of course, the strong correlation between linear industrial footprint and coyotes, but then everything else just went off in its own direction and did its own thing. And through another analysis, we found the same thing, that these species all respond differently to different forms of disturbance. Species specificity foils generalizations. So that means that we have to, unfortunately, there's not a single culprit we can target. We have to look at whole landscape as those predator responses all over the map. This is a real disappointment, and I love the look of disappointment on this cougar's face. At least that's how I read it. It's just that, oh God. And that's how we felt. We were pretty disappointed by that, but it also leads us to more research down the road. One of the great advantages of camera traps too is that we can detect much more subtle signals. So it's one thing to take a look at wolverines saying, oh, I think they might have retracted, and then realizing, oh my God, yeah, they have. We're probably missing a huge bunch of the population of wolverines off the provincial land base. That damage has already been done. What if we could detect problems before they're actually a problem, and detect some of these subtle signals of speciescapes, which we define as the interaction between species and in the landscape and each other. So this is work that was led by master student Sandra Frey, and published in RSEC and in Oikos. What Sandra took a look at is understanding how species split up their day. So one of the things, species have to deal with one another, and they have to deal with one another on top of all of the landscape features they have to deal with. One of the ways that they deal with that is to avoid each other in space, like wolverines and coyotes do, or they can avoid one another in time. And some of them will use the day, some will use the night. And this so-called temporal niche partitioning can facilitate stable coexistence. But is landscape disturbance messing that up? So we can take a look at animal activity patterns, because all these camera trap photos are time-stamped conveniently. We can take that information and plot it out through time. So we've got multiple samples through time and create an activity pattern, like the one for marten on the lower right here, which tells us marten activity peaks just before dawn, is really low during the day, and then peaks again in the crepuscular hours, and that's how they go about their business. So we took, or Sandra took a big smack at this question, and again, combined those landscapes of Wilmore and Kananaskis and said, do we see the same kind of patterns in the Wilmore, which has very low levels of disturbance, and Kananaskis country, which has very high levels of disturbance? So for each of these species, we took the timestamps off of the data and ran a kernel density estimation, which creates these daily activity plots, from which we can measure the amount of overlap between 0 and 1. So species that occupy the same time will have a high overlap. Those that divide up their day will have a low overlap. What we found is, really interestingly for wolves, is that wolves were more nocturnal on the disturbed Kananaskis landscape than the Wilmore landscape. So keep in mind that there's very little disturbance in the Wilmore. In Kananaskis is a really good paper by by Mark Hebblewhite and Jesse Whittington that showed that wolves are really heavily persecuted once they get outside the national park boundaries. There's a really good chance of them getting shot. Survival goes way down. So it appears that wolves are trying to avoid human activity by hanging out when humans aren't there in the nighttime. Now, interestingly, coyotes also showed a differential response. Coyotes in the WILLMORE, in the undisturbed landscape, were active at twilight mostly, so they're in the crepuscular hours. Whereas in the disturbed landscape, they were active all day and all night long. So basically, it's as though all bets are off in that disturbed landscape, which is, we think it's because wolves have been pushed to nocturnality, freeing coyotes and allowing them to go more. And we think that has a cascading effect. So we see in Kananaskis landscapes that martens actually are much more diurnal on the Kananaskis than the WILLMORE landscape. So what we have here is some pretty good evidence that landscape development does shift mountain mammal behavior, changes how they divide up the day, and that could be a subtle signal that tells us that there is a problem coming down the road that hasn't been manifested yet in populations. So finally, my one last thing I want to talk about is how we can combine camera trap data with telemetry data. So as I mentioned, telemetry data on its own provides, I think, a really unique data source that cannot be replicated by camera data for the most part. But camera data does the same, and there's a lot of power in pulling together these different data sets. So in some work that was done by my grad student, Jill Fraser, in collaboration with Laura Finnegan, who I saw on this call, hi Laura, at the FRI, she used camera trap data that we had from WILLMORE and Kananaskis and telemetry data that Weyerhaeuser and FRI had to ask, how do mother caribou make habitat selection decisions during the calving season, and how does this affect calf survival? So the question is, how do caribou with calves who successfully raise calves, how do they pick out places to live on their landscape? Do they make decisions based around predation risk or forage or disturbance features? We can get information on forage and disturbance features from satellite image, but not predation risk. And so this is where the camera data came in. So for the Narroway herd and the Red Rock Prairie Creek caribou herds, these are two that occupy the Rocky Mountain chain. They seasonally migrate. 50% of the calves died before the end of the calving period, based on Barry Norbett's really cool work, but really disheartening work too, right? So obviously calf survival is a big deal. So we asked whether or not moms that successfully raised calves were selecting habitat that allowed them to mitigate the risk to those calves. In a resource selection function, you compare the observed telemetry locations against some available telemetry locations. And we focused on moms with calves, dividing the data set up into successful moms and unsuccessful moms. So we took the telemetry data and we put it against a map of predation risk that we made. This is a heat map showing areas of low risk and high risk based on the occurrence of all of these different predator species. So each of these predation risk maps rates predation risk from 0 to 1 based on the probability of predator occurrence. And what Jill found is that Narroway moms trade off predation risk and forage, in that the good successful moms were much more likely to select for habitat that avoided grizzly bear and wolves, whereas bad moms did not. They prioritized resource selection around foraging, selecting for food, shrub, and herb cover. They did not avoid predation risk where it occurred. They ran afoul of the predators, and that's what led to the calf deaths. So that work's currently being submitted for publication. So in summary, camera trapping can examine community processes, predator-prey interactions, and competition in a way that nothing else can. We can research entire landscapes and combine data across landscapes for some really big picture questions. We can combine camera data and other data sources to ask some really new and important questions. In behavior, distribution, diversity, abundance, all these ecological hierarchies can be derived from a single camera trap data set if deployed right. And so for all those on the call who are working with camera data currently and are looking for advice or even just discussion about how it can be used, there's a whole network of folks like myself in BC and Alberta who are using it. And so I encourage us all to come together and have some of these discussions and share data to answer these big questions. And that's it. These are all the folks who paid me and helped me out.
Great, thank you very much, Jason. I think what we can do now is I'll just stop your timer. You stopped early, you'd like to know. We can go into questions. So if anyone has any questions, pop that into the chat right now. And I'll just let you know that I have a team online with me today from UBC's WildCO lab. They might help to field questions, especially if they're specific to the WildCAM network. So a big thank you in advance to Isla Francis, Alice Granados, who you met earlier, and Cole Burton. And we'll just start with questions if there are any, or comments would be fine too. And I'll relay those. Surprisingly silent. Okay, here we go. Is there a best type of trail camera to use? I remember this one came up last time. I'm not sure. Well, I'll let you deal with that.
We have used Reconyx cameras almost exclusively. We've found that in the kind of environments that we work in, where it can be very, very hot and very cold, they're the most robust to the temperature difference. Their battery life is long-lived. I think most importantly, their passive infrared band is considered to be the best on the market. And the camera trap really lives and dies on its PIR band. There's a website called TrailCam Pro that has done side-by-side comparisons of camera traps and rated them. And it's a really good resource. But I think they consistently find that Reconyx does the best job. They're also, of course, by far the most expensive. And so if you're trying to weigh spatial coverage against cost, there are other options out there, but my 5-star recommendation is Reconyx.
Okay, great. So earlier, we had a comment from Roxanne Tripp, and she just noted that it was interesting that this is when you were talking about the wolverines and their ranges. And she just said, it's interesting that Vancouver Island is still considered current range. I thought that the population was extirpated.
Yeah.
So if you might want to comment on that.
Yeah. I'm on the COSEWIC Terrestrial Mammals Committee, and wolverines are coming up in a couple of years. But yeah, wolverines are definitively extirpated from Vancouver Island. That's an error on the map.
Okay, great. Next up, we have, is there anyone, this question comes from Elka Wind. Is there anyone in your network investigating amphibians or reptiles using camera traps?
Oh, that is a great question. Nobody in my circle of network. The PIR, the passive infrared band, detects heat and motion. So requires a body heat signature to trip the camera. However, all these cameras, or at least Reconyx cameras, are capable of doing time lapse, meaning that you can set the number of times a day and the times that they'll just take a picture without being triggered by the passive infrared. And I think that's where the opportunity for amphibians and reptiles is. You set a camera up on a known reproductive site or movement site or something like that, and then have a series of photos taken throughout the day to track that occurrence or movement and whatnot. I think that's where that opportunity lies. I suspect there are people doing it. Matter of fact, I know there are because I've seen a couple papers on this, but they're pretty few and far between.
Jake, I can pop in and say 2 names that popped to mind in case somebody wanted to dig into that are Carl Larson at Thompson Rivers is doing stuff on rattlesnakes with camera traps at Hibernacula, and then Melissa Todd up on Haida Gwaii. Those are 2 people I know of who have been playing with that method.
Oh, that's cool. I did not know that about Carl. Very cool.
And there's a comment here from Catherine McGlynn that says the Summit Lake Toad Project is using these for culverts or in culverts.
Oh, neat. I'd like to learn more about that.
Yeah. Oh, City of Guelph too. Okay, great. So let's move on to the next question. Would it be possible, or have you thought about linking your camera trap data from the Alberta Biomonitoring Institute, from their camera trap programs? Is it likely that these data sets would be compatible?
Yeah, actually. So we've done more than just think about it. We've done it. In fact, I'm currently doing that right now and working with the good folks at ABMI, mostly around oil sands monitoring, to understand how the big regional scale camera trap data what sort of inferences can be made from those data compared to the kind of deployments that we use, which are smaller and more landscape based. The big difference is in design and what designs can tell you. So some of the questions that you ask are really design specific, say around density. There's also big differences too in how ABMI puts out their cameras versus how we do it. And I saw the question come up in the chat box, I think from Miriam, about bait and lure. So ABMI, when they go to a site, which are spread quite widely throughout the landscape, they go to a site and they go off in cardinal directions and lay out a camera at each cardinal direction from a central monitoring site. And there is a little bit of leeway in where they put that camera, but not a lot. 2 of those cameras they lure and 2 of them they don't. And folks in Cole's lab did a really nice job at showing the effect of lure on detections, what that has from ABMI camera data. In my use of the camera data, the lure makes a tremendous detection, like 2 orders of magnitude difference in detections in some cases. And of course, you live and die on your data density. And the deployment also really matters. So we put out our cameras to maximize probability detection. So put them on game trails. We expect that the camera site is going to be representative of the bigger landscape. And we do not want to miss an animal that would live in that bigger landscape because we put it at an inappropriate location. Whereas ABMI just puts it on that dot in the map. So what you end up with is quite a bit differences in data density, and what that means for inference is something we're exploring right now. I'll also follow up with Miriam a little bit further. How does the use of lure bait change what you can infer? I think it matters a huge deal. It's a great, really big difference in detection rates between lured and unlured sites. And as I said, detection rates are really, really important. Does bait or lure have an adverse effect on what you can infer? There's some folks that think that there is. Our research would tend to suggest that there's not. There's a lot more to be lost through missed detections by not bringing animals in front of that exist at that site, by not bringing them in front of your camera trap field of view, than there is to be lost in bringing an animal into that field of view. So PhD student Francis Stewart looked at this specifically using high resolution telemetry data on fishers over top of a camera trap array, and found that, that the lure at a site does have an effect on the amount of time that an animal spends in front of the camera, but you're only bringing that animal in a few dozen meters as opposed to in from another home range or something like that. And in fact, the heterogeneity imparted on movement by the landscape, right? Does an animal spend more time in habitat A or B, or how does it move through habitat A and B? That imparts a lot more heterogeneity on the amount of time spent than any lure does. So lure is just another thing in the landscape that animals have to contend with, but makes a big difference to your data.
Great, thanks. Okay, question here from Paolo Corti. Apologies if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. What is your opinion of using the combination of camera traps and distance sampling to estimate population size?
Oh, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And to be fair, I read a couple papers on it but I'm not fully familiar with how it works. I'm much more familiar with using spatial count and spatial capture recapture models, as well as random encounter and staying time models. And Cole and good folks at ABMI and Joe Berger at BC have just put together a paper that looks at the relative reliability of those different methods and came up with some really cool results. But in terms of the distance stuff, I don't know too much about it. I think that there's a lot of room and opportunity for people to explore those methods and to contribute to our knowledge of them. So many different ways we can cut this deck. We don't really know how the cards are going to fall out yet.
Okay. Will there be standardized protocols for camera trapping published soon by the provinces, similar to aerial inventory, for example? I'm sorry, I don't know who that question came from.
Cole, do you want to speak to that, or you want me to?
Yeah, I'm happy to, I think. Well, and you can fill in. Sorry, I was going to start my video, but I guess it doesn't work. So you get the links to look at, which is better anyways. Right. So we have, as you know, Jake, so thanks for tossing it over, but with working with Tyler and Muley, we've put a resource information standards committee, so risk protocol together for camera trap metadata standards. So there's a link to that from our wildCAM website. And that kind of details the specific information that people should be collecting and reporting along with their camera trap data. In terms of the next step, which would be protocols around the setting of cameras or data management, things like that. We do have some resources that we've put out on the wildCAM website, but as you probably get the sense of, there's still lots of research going on, lots of discussion, and perhaps some disagreement around which protocols are best. And certainly there would be some project specific or objective specific differences. So we have not pulled that together. That's a far bigger task that I think many of us are working on. But in terms of whether the province would, how they will adopt that and make that a risk protocol, I think that'll be some time for us to figure that out. But I guess short answer is I'd direct you to the wildCAM network website for what we have. But then of course, talk to folks like Jake and others who have great experience and we'll give you the lowdown on what protocols to use.
Thanks, Cole. And Cole, I think possibly your camera might work now if you wanted to try again.
Oh, I think it's, I don't know if anybody wants that.
Rather not. Of course we do. Okay, I'll move on to the next question though. So this one comes from Samantha. Are there specific behaviors that you look to observe with wolverines using camera traps in addition to presence and absence of data?
Yeah, great question. We noted when we were looking through the data, we noticed that there was behavioral differences by the wolverines at the camera traps. And that at some camera traps, which were baited with a great big frozen beaver carcass, at some of the camera traps, wolverines would show up and they'd play around, and sometimes there'd be a couple of youngsters and they'd fight, they'd climb the tree, take a rest at the tree, mess with the camera. At other camera traps, the wolverines just showed up, shot up the tree, grabbed the food, and then bolted. Going through the photos, we noticed that there was a spatial pattern to this. And so Francis Stewart did an analysis and published a paper on it in Ecology and Evolution that showed really clearly some marked behavioral differences by wolverines inside and outside the national parks. Inside and outside the parks complexes. So in the WILLMORE and in the national parks, a lot of variability in wolverine behavior. They could either be the smash and grab, get it quick, or the mess around. But outside, as soon as you stepped outside those protected areas into disturbed landscapes, all the wolverines were smash and grab. They all grabbed fast and they took off fast, which we interpreted as a risk behavior. because there's a lot of risk inherent in being up a tree at a carcass where other things can come and get you, or in losing that food to coyotes. And so it was really neat. We thought that was another piece of the puzzle that showed that there is something going on outside the parks that in those protected areas that affect how wolverine can use that landscape.
Great, thanks. We're going to keep trucking here. Are you okay? Yep, great. Okay, so this one comes from Stephen Borix. How did you account for variation in confidence with your heat map predator presence, with the heat map of predator presence in the caribou calf mortality study? So for example, density of camera trap locations, difference in survey period between cameras.
So those, it might be simpler, Stefan sent you the link, but basically what we did is we took the camera trap data and then fed that into generalized linear models that modeled the probability of observing one of those predator species against all of the natural and landscape features you'd find in that landscape. And then so we took the coefficients from those models and then mapped those out in the landscape. That's how we got the heat map. So the heat map wasn't derived just from the observations, it was derived from the relationship between the predators and the landscape. And so there's a bunch of assumptions built into that, of course, right? First of all, the models are valid and stable, and we produce the best, most valid and stable models we could, but there's always error around them that's not captured in those heat maps. And that you can reliably extrapolate across that whole landscape from our study areas. And so like all such endeavors, it has to be taken with a grain of salt, but we thought it was a pretty good place to start.
Okay, great, thanks. Here's another question from Elka. How do you lure both carnivores and herbivores? Or do you only focus on one group at a time?
So the lure, we've been using O'Gorman's long distance call, which is a trapping lure that's available out of Montana. And it's the same lure that ABMI uses. And what our early work shows is that everything comes in to investigate that lure, like everything. Flying squirrels, elk, mountain goats, sheep, you can see them all coming in and smelling that lure, which is what it's doing its job, right? Which is to bring the animal that's nearby into the field of view. And so it works both for predators and for herbivores. However, Cole's work with Joanna Berger showed that there was a difference in the detectability between herbivores and ungulates with the use of lure. And so I think that paper is really worth looking at and considering. I haven't fully wrapped my head around it yet about whether you're losing detections of herbivores all the time or under some circumstances or not. But for us, we use lure everywhere and rely on that to bring in all the species. That's what the photo data would suggest that it does.
Okay, thanks. Next up, another from Paolo. Do you have any recommendations for camera trap use or sampling design when monitoring species that naturally live in low densities?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I do. So the Acme Lab and collaboration with the WildCO Lab is actually working on that question right now. So in the WILLMORE wilderness, in that data I showed, we actually had two different designs in there. We had a systematic grid design, and then we overlaid over top of that with a stratified design based on habitat types and their rarity. And in the analysis that we're doing right now, we showed a pretty marked difference in the detection rates for rarer species between those two designs, with, as you might suspect, a whole lot more higher detection rates and more power in the stratified design. So I don't think there's blanket recommendations that I would reliably give, but I do think that logically, mathematically, and I think empirically, the use of a stratified design and targeting areas where you'd expect the animal to be and is a better approach than blanketing a landscape with cameras and hoping that you land in the places where those animals are. But again, a lot of caution. This is an area that's requires a lot more research, and that we're still converging on. It's still pretty fresh.
You're getting lots of questions.
This is where that's a great question. This is where the network, wildCAM's network, I think is so important, because this is the kind of questions that we throw to each other. Say, hey, has anybody got some data on this, or what are your thoughts on this? And this is what I'm thinking of doing. Does it make sense? And we're really going to, at that stage, we're really relying on one another for best advice, and that best evolves with every new analysis we run.
Totally. Okay, are you up for a few more questions?
Oh yeah, I'm here as long as you want me.
Okay, here we go. So this one comes from Taylor. For your work with linear features, you talked in terms of density of linear features. Do you think that using distance to linear feature might give you different results, since animals could be making fine scale selection for or against seismic lines?
Yeah, that's another good question. Yes. I think that distance to linear feature provides a sharper scalpel, more of a focus to be able to discern those fine scale behavioral influences. The problem is that's really difficult to do with cameras, because you have to place your stationary camera at multiple distances from a seismic line in a landscape. And if you've only got an array of like 60 cameras, which is still very, very expensive, you divide that amongst 4 treatments, you've got n equals 15 in each treatment, right? As opposed to telemetry data to answer such a question, where you can get 80,000 observations going everywhere from right at the zero distance to seismic line to 20 kilometers from seismic line. So this is one of those cases where telemetry data are a much better fit, I think, to answer distance to questions, whereas camera data are good at answering the kinds of questions that are landscape in nature. How much seismic occurs in the surrounding landscape, and how does that affect what you find at this point in space?
Right. Sorry, I'm just rearranging things here to not lose them. Okay, I just wanted to point out that you're getting lots of thank yous as we're doing this.
Oh, nice. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. So as we continue, Andre, he asks, you mentioned a week window in your temporally explicit approach to your wolverine coyote analysis. How did you come up with that period of time for your analysis? And is it based on detection rates of these specific species? I was thinking about assessing species interactions at specific locations, but with more common species.
Yeah, no, great question. Yeah, that's exactly why we chose a week. Because if you take a day, they never show up together within a day, right? Any given day, you got a coyote or you got a wolverine, but you never get both. Within the span of a week, we just kept increasing that temporal window. Within the span of a week, we found that gave us a data set we could actually model, and that sometimes the species were at the same spot within a week. A lot of the times they weren't. It's still pretty zero heavy. And then you would expand that temporal window into a month, then you just end up with spatial segregation. I think you're kind of removing that temporal aspect, because within a month you can expect both species to be at that site quite a bit, and then expand it further, and that temporal aspect goes away. So my recommendation would be to do that multi-temporal analysis, where you bin it into days and multiple days, and then a week, and then 2 weeks, and look to see what your data looks like in terms of the number of co-occurrences. It might be kind of unsatisfactory in terms of the concept behind co-occurrence, but you really got to play to your strengths, right? And probe the data to see what gives you best. For common species, you might be able to get away with a day or 2 days or something like that, but not for elusive things like wolverines, which range over 1,000 square kilometers.
Right. Okay, more thank yous. Here's a question from Danielle Thompson. Can you provide any advice to prevent bear and tear?
Whew. I thought I did. I thought we had the bear situation under control. But then the last time we went up to our most northern remote array, way up in the Richardson backcountry in northern Alberta, apparently a significant portion of our cameras had been hit by bears. And I still don't understand why that is, because it hadn't happened before. And sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. I don't know if you just end up with like one or two really belligerent bears that come and mess things up or what. I think the best thing I could recommend is the use of, for reconics, they have the C brackets that drill into a tree, and then you pop your camera into that and wrap the lock around it. Those seem to be pretty good at resisting bear damage. The bear has to work really hard at getting at your camera or even shifting it, as opposed to just affixing it, bungeeing it to a tree or something like that. Other models have bear boxes that do a pretty good job. Yeah, I think that the use of the C brackets of the bear box is the best thing I could recommend. But I think no matter what you do, if the animal wants to really mess up that camera, it will. The last camera we found was the last thing we saw was a big big bear hand like that, and then it ripped the face right off of the camera, and it was just laying there smashed at the bottom and then took off and walking. So yeah, those security enclosures are not cheap, but I think they're worth it, especially if you're spending a lot of money on deployment.
Right. Yeah, you just had somebody agree with that comment, the security enclosures. Okay, so this one comes from Matt Dyson. He says, he starts out by saying thank you. And then he says, with the ability to mass produce data from camera traps to increasing the ability to mass process the data through machine learning approaches, do you think time-lapse trigger mechanisms, example every 5 minutes, could provide higher detection than PIR methods for multi-species approaches?
That's a neat question. Maybe, I don't know. I'd have to see it. I'm very skeptical about the current state of machine learning to identify species in front of the camera. I know that some research groups have had some success classifying from the same species from the same ecosystem, but then you move that to a different system, a different set of species, and things tend to fall apart. So maybe one day we'll get there. I also think that by doing so, you lose a lot of the opportunity for exploration, right? Like we would have never hit on that wolverine behavior question if we hadn't been going through those images ourselves one at a time and thinking, wow, what is happening here? I think that opportunity for doing real science, which is coming up with questions you never thought of in the first place when you're looking at your data, is lost with machine learning. That being said, of course, it does help you mass produce data a lot. I think that's still ahead. And maybe someday that might be combined with just doing rapid time lapse and give you better occurrence data. It's possible. I don't think we're there. We're definitely not there yet.
Right. Okay, so Alice Anderson, she asks, do you think wildlife will ever get desensitized to specific lures, especially when no food reward is given?
We know they do. So in the WILLMORE, we lured the sites, and it was all helicopter access because we couldn't afford the time to go marching around that landscape ourselves, and we're too lazy. So we put the cameras out, lured them, and then came back 2, 3, 4 months later, variably, to pick them up. And so we could model, the probability detection through time, and it always tapers off. So in the first week, we had pretty high probability detection for, say, grizzly bears. And then it just leveled right off after 6 to 8 weeks. I think that's in part because the effect of lure diminishes over time. It might also be due to a desensitization effect. That being said, in some of our sites that we've left out for a full year, say in the Bighorn, we still get animals coming in to smell that lure days before we come to pick the camera up, so like a year after deployment. So the lure does stick around. Animals are still interested in it. It might be different ones. it's a great question. Don't think we really know that level of behavioral precision quite yet, but it's something everybody needs to keep in mind when they're deciding how often to relure, rebait, or check their sites.
Great. I've got one more question here, and then I think we might be coming close to the end of the questions. Oh, maybe not. So we'll start with this one. So Chris Neufeld, he asks, given your experience working in both marine and terrestrial systems, do you have thoughts on whether there are opportunities to create similar CAM-trap or wildCAM type network in the marine habitats? Example through baited underwater videos, perhaps?
I had never thought of that, Chris. That feels like something that Banfield Marine Sciences Center would be an amazing hub for. Marine wildCAM. I think the opportunities are tremendous, just as they are in the terrestrial sphere. I don't know of, so I have worked on baited underwater cams, as you know, looking at rockfish communities with John Volpe and his students. To my knowledge, there isn't a lot of collaboration from people who are using baited underwater video and baited underwater photography, but there really could be. Chris, maybe that's something we can talk a little bit more offline.
Great. Okay, so John Pax, he says, he made a comment, I don't know if you noticed that, he says, yeah, we use 15-minute time-lapse images to access sheep occurrence on alpine meadows at a distance of up to 700 meters. Detection decay was an issue. And then he says, have you tried an automatic lure dispenser? Has anyone else tried that?
John, I really want to talk to you about that sheep stuff, because we're going to be working on sheep up in the Arctic here shortly using camera traps. And in terms of the ALDs, no, I haven't. Talked to Rob Long, who spearheaded the development of those. He says there's still some time off before they're commercially available. I didn't ask him for like a pilot one to test it out, because I thought it would just be better to get a bunch and put them out. Apparently they're the bee's knees though. The folks, Wolverine folks down in the States have been using them, and apparently they've done a really nice job at mitigating that decay through time. So I think once they become available, they'll be incredibly useful. I would like to use them. So a lot of our sites that have helicopter access, we just can't afford to go and service them every month or 2 months and relure. So if we could use some of these ALDs, that'd be a huge improvement.
Okay, neat. I think if I'm correct, we're out of questions. So there's a little comment here from Elka when she says that she's seen underwater camera traps working. She just wasn't sure if they were baited.
Yeah, so the stuff we did was all baited. So we came up with this structure where there was the camera and there was a big long pole at the base of the camera with a cage in it, and then we put the bait inside the cage. And so the camera's taking a picture of the bait cage and then all the fish that come around into that field of view.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Miriam.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, hi, Miriam. Okay, so I'm gonna, maybe we'll unshare your screen there, Jason, and share mine, and I'll share mine. And I'm just gonna end on a couple sort of closing remarks and some thank yous. So can you see my screen there?
Yep.
Perfect, thanks. Okay, so I just want to thank everybody involved, of course, once again. So the Columbia Basin Trust for financial support, the WildCO folks with UBC for helping to put this these first two talks together with me. So Alice Granados, Cole Burton, and Isla Francis. The wildCAM network for your participation and support. A big thank you to everyone online who donated to the series. That's a huge help. If you're inclined to do so and you haven't already, you can find a spot to do that on our website, cmiae.org. And what I wanted to do next was just quickly highlight the next talk in the series. So for our next talk, we'll be departing from the camera trap theme, and we will welcome Blair Smith with the Creston Valley Wildlife Management Area, and she'll deliver a talk on the endangered barn swallows. So the Swallow Hotel, compensation habitat for barn swallows in the Creston Valley Wildlife Management Area. So that event will take place on November 12th. Of course, it'll be live webinar, same as we are doing right now, will be recorded and posted on our webpage. A big thank you, Jason. Thank you for taking the time to deliver this with us and share your knowledge. And for everyone who took the time to listen, there was a lot of knowledge and expertise in our attendees here today. Really fantastic group. I wish we could all see each other face to face.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and encourage you to reach out at any time. I'd love to chat with you if you've got advice for me. Please, I'd love to talk anytime. Is it, Haley, before you go, is it possible to get the chat, like the content of the chat window?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I've done, and I'll do it again now, is I've been copying it and pasting it into a Word document so we can have some of those links. So if anybody wants to get in touch with me because you missed the link, it's not as easy to pull out of the recording, I know. So I'd be happy to email that to you. But yeah, I have the content of the chat.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.